Welcome to the Highest Health Podcast. Raise your health, elevate yourself, and enrich your life. Experience a world of health sovereignty. As you near your highest health, you near your most luminous self. Welcome to the Highest Health Podcast. I'm your host, Natasha DeSaro, and today I'm delighted to have J Gulinello on Highest Health. Jay is brilliant at diving deep and broad into research and history, bringing to light commonalities and themes, creating a holistic picture of things to consider that is crucial when building your own informed understanding in health and medicine. Thank you so much, Jay. It's an honor to have you on.
Natasha, thank you so much for having me. And it's wonderful to see you again. I think we were talking offline. We met exactly a year ago in person, and it was really a lot of fun. And we had some great conversations around the dinner table. And so it's really nice to be back with you, at least in the virtual environment for now.
Likewise. Yeah, hopefully we'll get together in person in the future soon. But
Absolutely.
Why don't you kick us off with what you do and what your mission is?
So the mission seems to always change because there always seems to be a new need. But
Totally.
so yeah. So I have a sort of a strange, long and winding road for my career. I actually started off, I went to Berkeley as an undergrad and studied music, and I was an actor, or am an actor, really.
Wow.
I moved to New York. Yeah, that's actually what I did my entire life. So
So are
science
you
was
a
not something.
musician too?
Yes, yes.
Awesome.
Um, I I don't know how I ended up here, but I've learned to tell the story because it's actually, when people ask the question, it's made me reflect on this. So I a long time ago, I went to Miami. I did a showcase. An agent discovered me and asked me if I would move to New York and to be a musician and an actor. So
Wow.
I came to New York 13 years ago,
Wow.
and yeah, and I was auditioning uh for things like playing Elvis Presley on Broadway. I was doing a lot of musicals and things like that. You could probably see why. And
Totally.
so, so, but I needed to pay the bills, and acting and music is not a steady gig. And so I started as a personal trainer, and I quickly realized that without a better knowledge of nutrition, I couldn't really get better results for my clients. And so I started studying nutrition on the side. And then I just kind of fell in love with it as a second passion other than the arts. And went back to school at the Nutritional Therapy Association, and that was a year-long course, which was phenomenal. And then that made me think, I need to really dig into this. And so I just sort of like got a credit card in the mail, maxed that out with tuition, and I just said, I'm going to go back to grad school. And I went back to grad school for something completely unrelated to my undergrad and got a master's in clinical human nutrition. And now, my mission is to sort of try and change the narrative when it comes to health and nutrition specifically, and try to get people, I always say, out of the way of the oncoming train of chronic disease, because our chronic disease rates are so high. And I really feel like it's a lack of education. I'm not a fan of the top-down approach when it comes to health. I don't think the CDC or the FDA or the USDA is very helpful when it comes to nutrition and health. I think when we do a grassroots local movement and we educate people, they can engage in true prevention. And so that's become my mission, is to try and educate people and hopefully prevent them from ever developing these diseases that are just becoming all too common.
That's fantastic. I would say preventative health is health where you don't have to go through the illness of disease, and just that going backwards towards health is so much harder than maintaining health and doing it preventatively.
Well, that's a great point. Anything in life, when I was doing, when I was at Berkeley, I studied voice and I studied music production and engineering, but I had a brilliant vocal instructor. But unfortunately, I had done a lot of playing and singing prior to meeting him. And he always used to say to me, it's so much easier to train somebody who hasn't developed all the bad habits that you have. And I said, touche, that's totally true. In other words, like when you have a more of a blank slate, you have less cognitive dissonance to overcome. And it's a lot easier to instill proper nutrition and those things into people. But when you come in with a whole bunch of bad habits, then you've got to sort of break those down. And then you need to you need to build up something new. And that's just infinitely harder. So getting people when they're young is great. And I think that, and that's why I'm just a huge advocate for education, because it's just so much harder to do, as you said, on the back end. It's a lot easier to do, on the front end.
Totally. And it's particularly hard in the modern world where the messaging is so confusing and so wrong, in my opinion. So going towards
Mine too.
like non mainstream resources, I think is just eye-opening and expanding on knowledge that's not mainstream or messaging that's not
Yes,
mainstream.
that's so true.
Yeah. But on a different note, super cool that you came to New York to be an actor and you are a musician. I didn't know that, but I feel like it plays perfectly into podcasting and just being able to tell history and research in a way that's engaging. So really cool. I like that culmination.
I know I always I appreciate that, and it's part of my I think it's part of my unique take on this. I always I think about where do I fit into this world where there are so many people that are that I consider much smarter than I am, but I feel like the uniqueness that I can bring is that I bring uh, a creative approach to problem solving, and so maybe because I haven't spent my whole life in the science realm, that I can approach problems with a fresh set of eyes and a creative, out of the box thinking and perspective. And so when I do things like when we met last year and I was speaking at KetoCon, I really try and incorporate the performance side of my personality along with the educational side that I so because you can have all the knowledge in the world, and I've attended a lot of lectures where people were less than, and it's not their fault, but they were just less than interesting, and it's hard to hold people's attention in this day and age. And so if you can do it in a way that's a little bit more engaging, I feel like you can get the message across. And so I am always in awe of the people that have studied their whole lives and know a lot more than me. But I feel like maybe my contribution will be bringing something in a way that's more easily digestible to people and in a more creative environment. At least I'm hoping that's what I can do.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I feel like the for me at least, like the animal nutrition just has been a big thing for me just the past few years, just learning how important animal nutrition is. And I feel like I've heard that information prior to adopting it into my lifestyle, but it wasn't until I heard a specific person who delivered that information and it just hit in a way that I guess like spoke to my soul, spoke to my spirit. And I was like, oh, this like completely changed my life essentially. So being able to tell a
Amazing.
message in a particular way that captivates an audience and speaks to the human part of them, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, again, the message is extremely important, but I think the messenger does matter in terms of being able to relay the information in a way that you can, and also you have to be ready to hear it, of course. We're all at different points in our lives, and certainly I was on, my origin story was just like government guideline food pyramid. I bought into the low fat thing. I bought into the all the things that people tell me they believe. I have such empathy for them because I was there once upon a time. I believed what I was told because I never questioned it. But then once you start to question and you pull that string, then it's really hard to go back. And but everybody gets there at a different time, and it's really hard sometimes if you don't have that curious mind. It's really hard to accept the fact that you've either been misinformed or straight up lied to for a long time, and that's really a challenging thing because it shapes people's worldview, and a lot of people aren't ready to have that worldview shaken, I think.
Agreed. Yeah, it's hard to leave the knowledge that you knew and adopt a whole new paradigm. So, but that's a whole nother
The
topic of
comfort zone, right? It's
yeah.
a comfort zone.
Yeah, psychology is so fascinating.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it is.
yeah, but so going back to what you mentioned earlier, you and I met at KetoCon at a speaker dinner event, and we sort of hit it off. You lived in New York, I'm from New York, and we got into talking about how I believe you were working at a hospital, and
Yes.
during the whole COVID, the time of COVID, and you you shared some powerful things that happened to you, and just want to honor your boldness because, and I'm sure this will come out in your story, but essentially you had to change your career and leave your career due to the mandates. So I would
Mm.
love if you could just share that story and take us through that experience.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I knew that I was getting, so I got the job at the hospital in April of 2019, so well before COVID. And I was super excited because it was part of a pilot program. So you mentioned prevention earlier. And when I interviewed, this was a very rigorous process of the interview because they were creating a new department, essentially a prevention department. And it was a really interesting pilot program where I didn't actually deal with patients. I was brought on with a very small team, and I mean small, like three of us, to care for 4,000 employees of the hospital. So that was my charge, was basically the hospital wanted to pay for this program so that they could lower the insurance claims, absenteeism, the sickness of the hospital
Mm,
staff, and they thought that they could improve productivity, which is an amazing strategy. I love that strategy. And and so when I was hired, we had to build this thing from the ground up. And so we were doing things like doing blood testing for doctors and nurses in the program. And I was determining which markers I thought were the most valuable. And so I was choosing things that were very outside the norm. So I was asking for things like a fasting insulin and a high sensitivity C-reactive protein for inflammation. And I had nurses and doctors forcing me to sort of explain my reasoning for asking for these tests. And it was a proving ground for me to be able to stand on my own education and say, I know this is why this is effective. And I should also say I was in grad school as I was also in the hospital. So
mm.
I was trying to apply what I was learning. So it was happening simultaneously. And it was an amazing process. Again, 4,000 employees, not all 4,000 took part in the program, but I had I had brain surgeons sitting in my office sometimes. And here we are sitting here talking about the biochemistry of nutrition and mitochondrial energy production. It was really fascinating because for me, I could see actually where the holes in their knowledge base was. And to some degree, it frightened me that doctors were unaware of certain things because we think of doctors as like having the most up to date, at the peak of understanding of the human body. And where they do learn this stuff in school, a lot of them said, yeah, I mean, I learned it, but like semester one, which might as well have been, a lifetime ago. So,
Right.
um, and they certainly knew nothing about nutrition. That's the other thing I think your audience would find interesting. They may or may not know that physicians will readily admit that they get no nutrition training, if not zero, maybe one lecture.
Mm.
And
Wow.
so,
Dang.
right, which is again to the theme of this whole show probably will be prevention. How can you prevent disease if you have no knowledge of nutrition?
So true.
So I took this very seriously and I said, well, I'm going to be here to help improve their health outcomes, but I'm also, come hell or high water, I'm going to educate these people because I thought about the secondary effects of my talks with them, that they may take some of this information, and indeed some of them did take this information and then use it with their patients. So even if I didn't directly touch the patients, the doctors did. And
Okay.
if they had improved health outcomes, I thought, well, they'll realize that this N of one experiment that they've undergone and they've improved their health outcomes. Now they're going to be more willing to, when a patient comes in and says, I'm struggling with PCOS or I'm overweight or I have diabetes. Well, this nutritionist told me I should do this, this, and this, and maybe, and it worked. So maybe I could do. So I was just my head was full of all these amazing ideas about what I could accomplish, and then, as you alluded to, and then COVID hit, and I don't know. I think I think I go back to like when I was in history class in high school, and when we were studying the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I was very dubious of all the claims made in my textbook, and I started asking really probing questions to my teacher at the time, and she was not happy with me because we're supposed to learn Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated John F. Kennedy from the sixth floor of the school book depository. End of story. Moving on. And I was like, hold on, wait. and and I guess it was just that sort of always questioning things. And so COVID hit, and I was questioning a lot of things. And we got shipped out of the hospital for a few months
Mm,
initially because our offices got taken over because they needed to convert a lot of these rooms for triage and all of this. And then eventually we got brought back into the hospital, and then came the vaccine rollout, or
mm,
the whatever you want to call it rollout, right?
mhm,
And that was problematic because I knew that this was coming. I knew that the sort of mandate was coming, even though they had promised us it was not going to be mandated. And I don't want to get too in the weeds. I could tell your audience really interesting stories about how, they were making claims about it was perfectly safe for pregnant women, despite the
mm,
fact that there is no research on that. And
right.
that really infuriated me because remember, I'm caring for the doctors and the nurses at this hospital. So my population is predominantly women because the nurses are a predominantly female field, and they're the ones taking advantage of the program the most. And many of them, and young nurses in their 20s and 30s, they're at the peak of reproductive years, and they're thinking about creating families. And so to tell these people that whether they were trying to get pregnant or were already pregnant, that this was safe without backing it up with any research really alarmed me, because I'm all about evidence base, and there was no evidence for that. And Natasha, when I tell you, it was probably the hardest time in my career because everything you've ever heard, every side effect you've ever heard, from idiopathic hypertension to spontaneous abortion to death, I saw it. I had
Wow.
clients, I had clients die. I had
Wow.
clients develop chronic disease out of nowhere. A 63-year-old woman developed celiac disease 3 weeks
Wow.
after injection. I mean, I saw
Wow.
horrific things, and you can't unsee it once that's happened. And then the mandate came, which I knew was coming. And so I was sort of starting to look for a new position. But remember, I was also in grad school in my last few semesters. So I was so busy, I really didn't have a lot of time to look for another job. And as the mandate came down, I stood my ground and I said, well, my life is more important than this job, and it will be difficult, and I'll struggle to pay bills. And I'm in grad school, and amassed this massive amount of debt, and I don't know what I'm going to do, but at least I'll be alive long enough to be able to, or well long enough to be able to figure it out. And that's what happened. And so one day they unceremoniously, they set a date, and they said, if you don't get vaccinated by this date, you no longer have a job. And what was really hard was that
Mm.
my boss never even said goodbye. They
Wow.
came to me one day, they took my badge, they took my computer. I didn't even get a text.
Oh my
They just took my
God.
badge, and they said, they had security escort us out of the building, and that was it. It was over.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's a sort of abridged version of that story. And it was really sad because I had a lot of high hopes for that institution, and I had a lot of high hopes for the program that I was piloting. And um, but I'll tell you that all three of us, we all suffered the same fate. We stuck together, and we figured they won't fire the whole department, and they did.
Wow.
So
Dang.
that just goes to show you, the level of indoctrination. I don't think people remember at that time, but the belief in what was happening in the main narrative was very powerful, and it was really hard. Now you may be able to get people to admit, well, maybe things weren't as bad, but at that time, it was really hard to get people to understand that.
Yeah, the influence that messaging had on people was so strong. So when you told me this story back at KetoCon when we met at dinner, I just thought it was so powerful and just wanted to take a moment for you to share that because it takes such boldness and just want to honor that boldness that, you stood in and your courage that you stood in to, stay true to yourself and stand in your truth. Um, but from a psychological perspective, I'm curious, like, how did you do that in these times where, like, now, like you said, it's a little bit easier to kind of see both sides and, um, you, I guess, have a little bit more understanding. But during that time, it just seemed like everybody was just under that sort of brainwashing. So I'm just curious, like, like, do you have any insight, or it was just kind of like this internal knowing?
That's a great question, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I wish I had like some amazing answer. I want to say in some part it's self-preservation because I really did have to trust. So this is what I would tell people is that we have inherent gut feeling about things. They call the gut the second brain, and sometimes
Mm,
I even call it the first brain.
right.
It's very intuitive, and I saw a lot of people who knew things were not right.
Hmm.
They didn't know to the degree, and to be honest, I'm not claiming that I had knowledge of the extent. I mean, we know now some pretty alarming things about, I mean, just about everything, even just from the origins. You would think that embarking on this incredible societal altering lockdown and all these things, that you would at least even just be curious about the origins of this supposed pathogen. And we're still sitting here arguing about it today. So it was just interesting to me that you could start to see inconsistencies. And that's when I just started to really rely on my gut, not say, listen, I don't have to have all the answers. I just have to know that something is wrong and then trust my instincts. And also, I am a huge proponent of this preventative care. And I think I also had the advantage of knowing some doctors, and this is really important. I knew some doctors who were practicing very early on, and I'm talking like March of 2020. So, I mean, essentially, when this all kicked off,
Mm,
I knew doctors who were online. They were having 100% success rate, 100% success rate in treating COVID by not treating the label that was given to it. And then along with the application of that label came the idea that there was no treatment. Rather, they were just assessing the patients, looking at what they were, see what you see, and then just treat accordingly. And they were having, again, 100% success rate. And then they were being shut down for having success. And that was immediately when I knew, well, clearly this isn't about health, because if you're in a situation where there's an unknown and you want to truly solve the problem, the first thing that I would do, and probably you would do, Natasha, would be to pull all the best minds you can, hear all the ideas, and just sift through them and really try to solve a problem. But that's not what happened. What they wanted was simultaneously to say, this is a completely unknown, but the one thing we do know is that none of that stuff works. And I just remember thinking, well, you can't have it both ways. If it's unknown, that means everything is on the table. And
right.
it wasn't like that. And that was what just made me feel uncomfortable with the entire scenario. And I knew too many doctors who were being shut down for having success. And in my mind, I'm saying, well, again, if you want to solve the problem, you would go to those doctors and say, what are you doing that is so successful, so that we can vet it, we can figure out how to, mass produce it, whatever it is you're doing in this clinic and you're having success. What do we do? How do we mimic
Hmm.
that? And that's not what happened. And so the psychology to me was just really about trusting your gut and admitting to yourself that rather than the messaging, you see what you see. And once you realize the world around you isn't maybe exactly what it seems, it's a lot easier to make those decisions. And it does require some boldness, because people are going to tell you that you're crazy, and they're going to, they want to, rather than trusting the evidence, they want to trust authority. And that's my
Hmm.
big thing, is that I think we're practicing a lot of authority-based medicine and authority-based nutrition rather than actual evidence-based nutrition or evidence-based medicine. I think that's the disconnect, to be honest.
Absolutely. And I feel like what you saw there was just brought the question to mind for me was like, okay, so is this about keeping people healthy and safe, or is it about control? Because it's like we have these doctors practicing these methods and treatments and they're working, but we're going to shut them down and we're going to say, nope, we can't do any of that. So at that point, it's like, wait, if it's working and we're not even like, a little bit curious, like it's just a complete red flag.
Curiosity, that's one of my favorite words. I thought the same thing. I said, how can you not be curious about what's going on here? And simultaneously remember that the protocols in the hospitals that I was in, the ventilator remdesivir protocols, were killing people at an 80% rate. So
Yes.
complete you have this completely opposite end of the spectrum. You've got some clinics that are having massive amounts of success by doing it their own way. The hospitals, I'm watching people die in the hospitals. I even saw I just remember this story. One of the nurses at the hospital, uh, she was an older nurse. She was treated with that protocol, and she died. And I
Wow.
overheard the conversation that the family was suing the hospital because of the protocol. And I just thought, this just isn't right. If Anna, I mean, maybe it's naive, but if you're trying to solve a problem, how can you pretend that these other people are not having success. None of us would act that way in this scenario unless we were trying, as you said, to control a narrative and to protect a narrative. That's the only answer for that. And whether you think it was intentional or not, it was done. I watched it happen. And that profound lack of curiosity was very alarming to me. And it made it very easy, to be honest. When I walked out of the hospital that day, I'll tell you, Natasha, I didn't have not even 1 second of doubt, not even 1 second of doubt that I wasn't doing the right thing. I was completely committed to my decision. And to this day, I feel like I'm even more committed because I see the downsides of this, even in my own family. I see people who have been devastated by this untested therapy, and it's just it was never a consideration, and I never doubted what I did, even for a moment.
That's incredible. And it speaks volume to your ability to be in touch with your intuition, which is, I feel like in today's society is not something a lot of people can say. And especially like as a male, I feel like women, from my perspective, are a little bit more intuitive, but men, I think, are just like, in my opinion, are a little bit less intuitive. So I think that speaks volume. And
I know all I know is that my mother used to always say, as a child, my favorite question was why, and it drove them crazy because it just was
yeah.
the answers were never enough for me. I always wanted to know one layer deeper. Always wanted to understand, and I agree with you. You know, in my field, it's predominated by women, and in my NTA training and my grad school cohorts, I was like usually one of two or three guys. For
Mm,
whatever reason, it seems like women are more interested in their health, more interested in, and I mean, the field of nursing is predominantly female as well. And I think that's just the caretaker aspect of the female constitution.
hmm
But there is an intuition. I agree with you with females. And I think men, maybe they think they can power through things, or they don't take the time to quiet the noise to listen internally. And I haven't always been good at it. Sometimes I've just bowled ahead, but I've really tried to, as I've gotten older, I've really tried to make a point to listen to that voice. I do really feel like that's a missing link when it comes to navigating a world that is full of information. And that's a good thing, but it also means it's complicated to figure out where the truth lies. And so to settle everything down and to listen to that inner voice sometimes is really the only way you can get started on that path towards truth, I think.
So well said. Yeah. And just a few other points that I wanted to bring up for just our listeners to remember is like they were shutting down alternative voices that
Mm.
were doing practices that, were helping people, but also just telling the public to isolate, to stock up on food, only go grocery shopping like once a month, meaning like you can't really buy fresh food and it's got to be all like, I mean, food that lasts for a month is probably all processed and packaged. Stay indoors, avoid the sun, which is like the most powerful immune enhancer. and and then just the whole like destruction of community, like telling people to isolate, and like it personally felt like an attack on the human spirit to me. um and I
Oh
and
boy, what a great
it,
point.
and I feel like it's just something important to remember because me personally, I like to see the love, see the light, and I forget about these things quickly. But if you look at history, like these kinds of things start off the way like COVID started, like slow and taking away, like telling, like kind of sort of testing the population and seeing what they would listen to and slowly telling them to do certain things. And then after a while, you're just like, you're so far in that you don't even realize what happened. So,
That's my favorite analogy, the frog in the boiling water, right? You can't throw a frog in while the water's boiling. You have to slowly turn the heat up, and people don't even realize what's being taken from them. And yeah, I mean, I had a lot of hard conversations, even with family members, knowing you your whole life. And all of a sudden, because of what I did, they no longer even wanted me to be around them. They were afraid to be around me. And what's interesting is that, now you have that dilemma where now it's all over and they want to pretend like that never happened. Right?
yes.
Like they have no problem being around me now because everything has subsided, but it's never going to leave my consciousness that in at the greatest moment of choice, you made a choice. And it's hard to it's hard to forget that you made that choice, because now I
Hmm.
know that if that choice were to be presented to you again and I was going to rely on you for something, I can't rely on you.
That's a good point.
And I don't know what to do with that. And I don't know if anybody really knows what to do with that. It's like I always want to give people the benefit of the doubt if they're uneducated and uninformed and they make bad decisions. But these were bad decisions that were being made for a very long time. It wasn't just in the moment. It was this even lasted a year or two. We're 4 years into this and I still see people outside wearing masks. And I just wonder, when is it over for you? And the first step to education and altering course is to admit that you were wrong. And so when I see people now coming out and questioning things who were once upon a time on the other side, I say, yeah, that's great, but you have to be asked. You have to ask for forgiveness. You have to ask. People
Hmm.
want amnesty for everything. Well, we didn't know. No, no, no. A lot of people did know, and you silenced them, and that's why censorship is so dangerous. So, no, no, no.
Yep.
There has to be a moment where you accept you did something wrong, and maybe you need to even take a back seat next time something like this comes up, and allow people who can be calm in the face of immediacy. There's this immediate need to react, but I always say, listen, we need to take a moment, especially when you're engaging in things, as you said, that could rip apart society. Those are not. How much have we set back children's education because of this? And these are things that should never be taken lightly. And you can never allow one person or one small group of people to make those decisions. And if we didn't learn anything else from this scenario, I think we need to have learned that going forward. And you, you just always have to have the conversation. And it's hard to think how to go forward from there. But this penetrates into other areas of life too. It wasn't just COVID. It's part of the human condition, and we have to be very aware of it, I think.
Yeah, I met a Holocaust survivor during the time of COVID, and some
Ah,
people would criticize me for comparing that time to the Holocaust times. And it was the first thing she brought up. She was like, "This is the type of control you have to be weary about because during the time of the Holocaust, it was very slow, where they started with the division of people, them versus us, and it was under the guise of." We are doing good. Like, this is for our best interest. And it was just so, like, I already had my opinion at that time. So she was only adding, gasoline to the
yeah.
fire. But I just thought it was so powerful that, like, if a Holocaust survivor is comparing that time to her experience during such a horrific point in history, like, it's really important for us not to forget our experience and, the attack on human health.
I mean, I don't think it's inappropriate at all. I mean, it's because we're talking about human psychology, and in both cases, a lot of people died, and in both cases, it was. I heard a similar story where people, again, they tend to trust until it's too late. I heard the story of a
Mm,
survivor as well, who was a young boy at the time,
mm,
and sadly, his mother, because at the time, people forget that Germany was democracy,
mm,
um, where they had a lot of freedom, and he was telling the story that he was asking his mother, about the Nazis, saying, are we in trouble? And she said, no, the government will protect us, the police will protect us, we're a democracy. And she kept that attitude, he said, right up until they were in line at the concentration camps, that she never
wow.
believed that this could happen to them. And that's the message that I try and tell people. There's a recency bias that we think that this would never happen in a free society, but it has happened. And I'll tell you something else, that since that, all these restrictions may people think that they have lessened, and they have lessened, but they haven't gone away. And what they've done is they've conditioned people to accept that response to some kind of a imminent threat. And so what happens when the next threat comes along? People are going to be much more willing to go down that road. And I'm trying to advocate for, no, this was a colossal failure on every
Mm,
level, and we can never allow that level of control again, because it's perceived safety. It's not even
mm-hmm.
real safety. It was
Right.
perceived safety. And we lost liberty in the process. And our founding fathers were very adamant about that liberty comes with some degree of risk. And it's better than losing all freedom, because when you lose all freedom and the government controls everything, historically, that never ends well either.
So
So
true.
it's
Yeah.
it's super complex, and you have to understand history to understand that. So I don't think it's inappropriate to compare it to those historical events at all, because it's humans doing it all the time, and so human nature over time usually doesn't change.
Let's get into our food supply And the recent experience and case with the Amos Miller farm,
Mm.
um, and just your thoughts on why controlling our food supply is just, just your thoughts in general. We'll just leave it, we'll leave it at that.
And when you asked me this question before, I really tried to figure out a way. I was like, I'm gonna put a spreadsheet together because I need to figure out how to elevator pitch this thing. And there's really no way to do it because
Mhm.
people, even though if people know what's going on. So Amos Miller is an Amish farmer in the state of Pennsylvania. And for people who are unaware, he's been having legal troubles with the USDA for years.
Mm,
Uh, and it's bizarre to me because you live in California, correct?
yes.
So in the state of California, because I have been there many times and I spent a month there back in 2015 uh doing some acting work actually. And
Oh, cool.
I remember going yeah, I remember going into the grocery stores because where I live, raw milk and raw dairy isn't legal. You can't buy it in a grocery store. But I went to the grocery stores in California and I was like, look at that. There's raw milk on the shelf. You can just buy it. And
Yes.
I remember I remember thinking, this is really interesting because we're told that raw milk is inherently dangerous. And so as I was standing there in the supermarket, I kept looking around and thinking, well, if it's so dangerous, how come like I'm not hearing announcements over the PA saying, dead body in aisle 4, like
Right.
why are we not seeing people keel over in the dairy section? So and this was before any of my training. I mean, I kind of knew that it wasn't inherently dangerous, but it was a weird societal thing for someone who's from the East Coast where none of that's legal to go out to the West Coast and all of a sudden it's there. So that's just to set the stage for the fact that that's why Amos Miller has been under the crosshairs of the USDA. So during this process, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture was on a lot of these calls, and they never said a word. According to their attorney, they just sort of were monitoring the situation, but they never intervened at all. They were just letting the USDA do their thing. And then eventually, at some point, they settled their case. I think Amos Miller may have had to pay a couple of fines, and they were trying to get him to essentially get a permit for the raw milk. But people have to realize that he was never selling to the general public. Like you can't
Mm,
buy Amos Miller's products in the store. It's a personal buying club. So you have to pay to join the club and then you can only purchase it through them. So it was a private sale. It was almost like if you and I decided to exchange uh, goods and services for money, right? Like it's not a public exchange of goods. And so he was exempt really under Pennsylvania law from having to have a permit. And if he chose to get a permit, one of the caveats would have been that he would have been limited to only selling raw milk. That would be the only
hmm.
thing that he was allowed to sell. And
Interesting.
he sells raw yogurt, he sells kefir, he sells colostrum, all things that people want. So he chose not to get the permit and not to sell commercially. And USDA eventually said, fine, no problem. And then the beginning of 2024, all of a sudden the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture stepped in and they raided his farm. Literally, I think it was the day or two after the turn of the year. So it was like January 3rd or 4th. They
Hmm.
raided his farm and they ordered detainment and destruction of all of his food products.
Wow.
Crazy. I mean, I have pictures,
Isn't this
Natasha.
a private property? Like, is that even
It
allowed?
absolutely is. well, this gets wild, and this is really what we're talking about here. Is like we're testing the limits of the U.S. Constitution, and we're
Mm,
testing the limits of U.S. law because some of the things that happened in this case have never happened in American history.
wow. Dang.
So, so we really have to, as a people now, we have to decide what we want to allow to happen to us, right? So, yes, they raided this sovereign citizen's private property, his farm. Um, I have these bizarre pictures, Natasha, of like fermented foods and apple cider vinegar, raw apple cider vinegar with like caution tape, like it's some kind of
Wow.
biohazard. It was like $500,000 of product to be destroyed. Now, this man has been in business. His family has been in business for a quarter of a century. And Natasha, I just need to like make this clear to your audience. Not one complaint ever, ever.
Wow.
No one's
And
ever gotten sick. No one's ever complained about the food ever. This is purely a government intervention. No one complained about Amos Miller.
that's heartbreaking and and scary, honestly.
And it's really heartbreaking when you see the pictures of, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture taking products and you're just looking at the family members standing there helpless. There's nothing they can do. Um, but it gets worse and it gets weirder. And this is where I want your audience to really consider what's happening here, because I hear the other parts of the argument, like, well, he should get a permit. And as I told you, well, then there's a philosophical debate. Does the government have the right to make you get a permit to grow food on your own land and to sell it to people who want to buy it, not in commercial stores? I would argue absolutely not. The government has no right to intervene there. This is a private agreement between myself and this farmer, and the
Hmm.
government has no business in there. You know,
Absolutely.
if
Yeah.
he was trying to sell it at Walmart, absolutely, that's fine. Then we have an argument, but that's not what's happening here. So they were so bold that they actually told him, I mean, you can't even make this up. They told him he was not allowed to even eat his own food. Like, not only could he not sell it, he wasn't allowed to eat his own food, and he wasn't even allowed to feed it to his own livestock. So he couldn't grow food and feed it to his own pigs.
Wow. So he's not allowed to eat the food he grows. He's not allowed to give the food he grows to his animals or family, I
Correct.
would assume too.
Exactly.
Wow.
What they did was they rationed out a certain amount of food. So he had to ask them. And they would say, okay, if you want to feed your family, you can only have this and you can only have so much of that. I mean, they wanted to literally control the food that he put on his dinner plate at the end of the night. That's how crazy it went.
Dang, this just strikes me as North Korea when I hear this.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. They did all kinds of unlawful things, like they tried to interrogate Miller without his attorney present.
Hmm.
They and so one would assume that when they were breaking the law, this was very clear. And so his attorney sort of hypothesized that maybe they have the local judge in their pocket, because clearly if this went to trial, which it did, they would lose because they were breaking black and white laws. They were breaking
Mm.
laws that were written in black and white. But again, it seems like when the government wants to push something forward, some kind of a narrative, there's just no length that they're not willing to go in order to do that. And so this was a huge legal battle, and it went back and forth, and eventually the injunction, the Ames Miller won that court case, and he was at least allowed to continue to feed his family. And then, because this is only the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, he was then allowed to sell his products to people outside of Pennsylvania. So, which is important because that's the lifeblood of his business. And
Right.
he's actually my farmer, so I personally get Amos Miller's food. So for a while, Natasha, I couldn't order anything, couldn't order
Wow.
any food that I normally order. So this really hit close to home, and I was monitoring this case because on his website everything was just out of stock because I wasn't allowed to purchase it. Um, which is just, again, in America, you just think that's not can't be possible, but it is. Um, so so unfortunately, the people of Pennsylvania still can't purchase his food.
Hmm.
And again, I want to say that this is the first time this has ever happened in American history. The first time that a government has claimed authority to seize, destroy, and prohibit a person from eating and growing their own food because they don't have a permit. Just bizarre. Um, and I also just have to point out that if you just go online right now and Google, or search food recall, I found like Walmart, Costco, and Trader Joe's all in the same time this was all going on, all had food recalls on pasteurized dairy, like dairy that supposedly is pristine and perfect according to the USDA, and nobody tried to shut down Costco or Trader
Wow.
Joe. So and you've got people dying in some cases where, again, Amos Miller's never even had a complaint, but yet they want to shut down this Amish farmer, and you have to ask yourself the question, why is that? And I have my own theories, but I think everybody at home should ask that question: why are they so obsessed with this Amish farmer? And personally, I think because he was able to upscale his operation, so he sells to every state in the country, excluding Alaska and Hawaii, but he sells to
Right,
all the
right.
continental states. And I think that people realize how healthy they become by eating this untainted food. And if he continues to export that way, the Amish also just generally have better health outcomes
Absolutely.
overall. They just live a different lifestyle. They don't engage in our medicine, they don't engage in our nutrition, and they don't engage in our education. And yet
Wow.
somehow they have better health outcomes. Their children are just better adjusted across the board. Just everything about the Amish community, statistically, is better on the health front. And I think that they're afraid if people get a hold of that lifestyle, they will realize that maybe we don't need, you know, big food and big pharma to live a healthy life. It's not that those would go away. I mean, there'll always be a need, and I'm not, bashing all pharmaceuticals. Clearly, there's a time and a place, but you have to wonder why. And I came back to that fact that I think they want to crush the competition, and the Amish are the competition to the mainstream narrative that we must have medications to be healthy and we must eat the food pyramid to be healthy. And I think the Amish are the clear-cut example of how that's not the case, and there are studies to prove it. And that's my reasoning why they're trying to do this, because it has nothing to do with anything but control, as you said. They're not allowing him to eat his own food. That's not about health.
Agreed.
So
Yeah.
a bizarre
That's
case.
Yeah, that is a bizarre, powerful case, and I'm sure it wasn't really publicized anywhere. So you bringing it to light is really important, and it touched home for you personally. Um, the first thing that came to mind is just is like this is an attack on our birthright, like our birthright to grow food on our own property, and feed ourselves in the way that we find most nourishing and fulfilling. And then the second thought I'm having is like these authoritative agencies, they want to regulate the food that we grow on our own property in the guise of keeping us safe because, oh, raw milk, it's dangerous, etc. But the they don't regulate anything that comes from like the lab. Like we can have all these chemicals in our food, all these different colors and words that we can't pronounce. All of that is okay, but stuff that comes from the earth, oh no, like let's
Right.
raise a red flag here and honestly destroy this person's livelihood.
It's nonsensical. I mean, you make the point so succinctly, and it's just so clear when you look at it that way. That why? Well, why? Because these food additives and all these things, they have lobbies in Congress, and so the politicians who just want to get reelected and want to be able to raise money, they don't want to anger these big corporations, right? So, but
Mhm.
the Amish have no lobby. The Amish don't even have cell phones. They have no
Totally.
lobby in Congress, and most people would be shocked to realize that a lot of these food additives, while some of them, or I should say, not some of them, they've all been tested to some degree, but I will tell you what has not been done. They've never been tested in conjunction with one another. In other
Mm,
words, you can get one food additive that has been tested. Okay, great. Toxicology and all this stuff is done. Then you put it in a food along with 75 other food additives. But guess what hasn't been done is the conjunction of all of those ingredients together on human health. Those studies have never been done. That's the way we consume the food. So wouldn't it make sense that you would need to understand the effect on the human body when all of these things are added together? And that's why, and I'll just say as an aside, that's also the case with the childhood vaccine schedule, that
mm.
the individual components have been tested, but they have never been tested in conjunction with one another. And all I care about is what they're like together, because that's how humans are exposed to these products. And so it's
Absolutely.
completely irresponsible for people to say that a product, like as you said, close to earth, which is like raw milk, which has only one ingredient, to these other products that have a mishmash of ingredients that have never been tested together, and yet somehow we're supposed to just inherently trust those products and those agencies, which have been shown time and time again. And I write about this all the time. You can find a litany of legal cases where the FDA or the USDA or the EPA have all been caught with their hand in the cookie jar, taking money from corporations in order to turn a blind eye to things. And then, you'll get the recall later on. What happens in the meantime? People get sick, people die, and it has to become a lawsuit before we're able to realize the truth. I don't know. I think we should take the precautionary principle when it comes to those kinds of things, Natasha. And I can't understand why people are so willing to trust these organizations who, in the past, they have a long track record of dishonesty with the American people. And if nothing else, the Amish people are just presenting, you don't have to buy their food, but if you want to buy it, why should that be illegal? It
Yeah.
blows my mind.
Yeah, I don't think there is a logical answer that you and I can come to that we would both be like, "Oh, I understand this." But I mean, I guess there sort of is, honestly. It's like what comes to mind for me is like follow the money. So once you start following the money, then you understand. And unfortunately, like inherent within that is malintent. I hate to think of these like conglomerates when there's money involved, like people's morals and values, they just go out the door.
There's a great illustration of this. It is a story that a lot of people don't know, and I'll tell it really quickly. That the Bayer Corporation, right, who recently purchased Monsanto,
Mm,
um, in the 1980s, they had a drug that was created for hemophiliacs, and I believe it was called Factor 8. I might be wrong, but I think that was the name, and it was tainted with HIV because,
hmm.
well, one of the reasons was that they inappropriately harvested some of the components for that, and that's a long story. But bottom line is it was tainted with HIV, and they knew this, and so they made a cold, and I stress cold and calculated decision where they knew that it would cost them X amount of dollars if they just dumped the product because it costs money to manufacture and it's tainted with HIV. So if we get rid of this, we're going to lose all this money. But so we can't sell it in the United States. But if we sell it overseas, give it to people who have hemophilia, then we may or may not get caught. And if we get caught, we'll have to pay fines and we'll have to pay millions of dollars to families. But there's a good chance that the amount of money we will have to pay in legal fees will be less than the money we would have lost had we just dumped the product. And let me tell you something, that's what they did. They sold it
Wow.
knowingly, tainted with HIV, killed people in other countries in the East, and they were caught and they paid millions of dollars in legal fees. But to them, on the back of the envelope calculation, it was a net win for them because they literally don't care about human life. It is just a money versus life. And well, hey, if we can save money, who cares how many people die? That is a story. You can go look it up. The New York Times wrote a huge piece on it in the 1980s. And it's disgusting. And it shows you that these companies, that's the perfect illustration of they don't care about you. And if you can't get that through your head, you're going to constantly make bad decisions. So you have to understand that these entities do not care about you. They only care about the bottom line. And you are just a number on a ledger to them. That's all you are.
I try to like sugarcoat stuff for some reason. Like I don't want to believe that they don't care, but I know it, like they don't care. And that is such a good story that shows that it's not about your health, it's about money. I think you froze on me. Thank you for listening to Highest Health. If you gained value from today's episode, leave a review, share with a friend, or post on social media. If you're interested in achieving your highest health or already pursuing it, send me a DM. I'd love to hear from you.